They laughed when she asked for it. Right there, on the polished obsidian floor of the Interstellar Claims Tribunal, they laughed. The sound wasn't kind. It was sharp, predatory, the sound of a dozen non-human delegates enjoying the utter humiliation of a refugee species brought to its knees. The poor dragon girl, her name was Sereth, bowed her horned head and whispered, "Could you give me a hug, please?" To them, she was just another defeated creature, clinging to a human out of desperation. And humans were supposed to be weak. The Grand Chamber hung in silent orbit over a dead world, a place where cold verdicts replaced bloody wars. And on this day, the Drakari had lost everything. Sereth was the last daughter of a minor clutch, her wings bound in dull gray suppressor bands that chafed and burned. Her scales were cracked and dimmed from malnutrition. Her tail curled tight around her ankles to hide the uncontrollable tremor. She stood beside Elias Crow, a human civilian liaison. He was unarmed, dressed in a simple black coat that marked him as nothing special in this room of armored giants and crystalline beings. The tribunal's benches loomed high above them, filled with towering insectal judges, silent observers, and the delegates of the Court Dominion, the very empire that had burned Drakari space to ash and now argued it had been nothing more than a legal reclamation. Elias felt every single eye on him, a familiar weight of being dismissed before he even had a chance to speak. Humanity had only been admitted to the Galactic community 20 years earlier. We were classified as low threat, low strength, and high emotion. Useful, but ultimately insignificant. Sereth had been coached by their legal team to beg for mercy, to appeal to sentiment, because that was the only recourse the tribunal allowed for conquered species. But her request for a hug, that wasn't in the script. That was pure, unfiltered instinct. It was fear. The court delegates' mandibles clicked in amusement, a dry, rasping sound that echoed through the chamber. How fitting, it broadcasted, its voice amplified and dripping with scorn, that the dragon whelp seeks comfort from the soft-skinned pet race. The judges allowed the insult. They always did. Elias didn't move at first. He saw the dark bruises along Sereth's arms, where restraint fields had bitten deep into her flesh. He saw the way her wings twitched uselessly, the powerful muscles wasting away from the shoes. He also saw the human security officers lining the walls, standing rigid, silent, under strict orders not to intervene. Humanity was here on probation, after all. One wrong move, and we would be sanctioned right back into irrelevance. Sereth looked up at him then, her eyes luminous and wet, her pupils slit with terror. She repeated her request, quieter this time, a fragile whisper that almost got lost in the cavernous room. Please. The tension had been building for weeks, long before this final humiliating moment. The Drakari had been our allies, a proud spacefaring people whose fire-breathing myths had once made other species nervous. But they had trusted the wrong treaties. They had dismantled their own planetary shields under court security oversight, and they had paid for that trust in fire and ash. Humanity had protested. We filed motions, submitted mountains of evidence documenting war crimes, and we were systematically ignored. We were too new, too small, too human. Elias had been forced to watch footage of Drakari cities burning to the ground while tribunal clerks impassively stamped documents. His orders were to stay calm, to stay procedural, to let the system work. But systems are built by those in power, and power always favors those with claws and fleets. As the hearings dragged on, the court grew bolder. They openly mocked the Drakari survivors, brought in as witnesses, pushing Sereth forward like some macabre curiosity, a living symbol of their total and complete defeat. But they didn't notice the subtle things. They never looked close enough. They didn't notice the way Elias's posture never slouched, the way his eyes didn't just watch, but tracked exits and angles. They didn't see the faint glint of metal at his wrist, hidden just beneath his sleeve, a device no one had even bothered to scan, because why would they? Humans weren't considered dangerous enough to hide weapons. When Sereth asked for the hug, the entire chamber expected him to refuse. They expected him to maintain decorum, to prove humanity's feigned emotional weakness through sheer embarrassment. Instead, Elias stepped forward. A collective gasp rippled through the benches as he crossed the invisible line separating advocate and subject. The judges began to stir, to call for order, their voices booming. But he was already kneeling, bringing himself level with the terrified girl. Slowly, deliberately he opened his arms. Sarah froze for a heartbeat, then she just collapsed against him. Her forehead pressed into his shoulder as a sob tore out of her, a sound so raw and uncontrolled it silenced the entire tribunal. Elias wrapped her up, careful of her bound wings. He placed one hand steady between her shoulders, the other firm at her back, grounding her, holding her together. It wasn't an act of gentle pity. It was a statement. It was protection. The chamber fell utterly silent, steeped in a confused, uncomfortable stillness. And then the turning point arrived, as quiet as a held breath. Elias spoke, his voice carrying clearly without any need for amplification. "Record this," he said, his words ringing with cold authority. "This is what your law looks like." His wrist device activated. A lattice of brilliant light erupted from it, cutting through the tribunal's own suppression fields like they were made of paper. In perfect unison, every human security officer along the wall straightened, their eyes lighting up with the same signal. The judges frantically tried to shut it down, but the system didn't respond to their commands. Humanity had never been strong enough to challenge the tribunal by force, so we hadn't tried. We had challenged it by learning it, by meticulously mapping its networks, its redundancies, its every blind spot. We challenged it by waiting. Elias stood, Sarah still clinging to him, and the projection shifted, filling the vast chamber with undeniable truth. Data, footage, timelines. Drakari worlds before and Drakari worlds after. Core fleet movements logged by humble human civilian telescopes the Empire hadn't even bothered to classify as a threat. Signed orders hidden under layers of sanitized language, authorizing extermination. "You called this legal," Elias said, his voice level, devoid of passion, yet heavier than any shout. "You called us emotional for objecting." The court delegate tried to speak, to bluster, but his communication channel was immediately overridden. One by one, the other delegates realized their private comms were locked, their exits were sealed. Not by weapons, not by force, by law. Human law which had been painstakingly embedded into the tribunal's own code over years of quiet compliance and observation. The climax wasn't an explosion, it was a collapse. The judges began arguing amongst themselves as their own precedents were turned against them, as clauses designed to protect empires were applied flawlessly to the Drakari. Sanctions triggered automatically. Trade locks snapped shut across the galaxy. Core fleets suddenly found their navigation rights revoked in all neutral space. Panic rippled through the chamber, not the fear of death, but the cold bureaucratic fear of consequence. Elias didn't gloat. He simply held Siri's hand as the verdict was read, amended, and rendered irreversible. The Drakari were officially recognized as a protected people. Reparations were mandated. Court representation on the tribunal was suspended pending a full investigation into their war crimes. When it was all over, when the lights dimmed and the chamber slowly emptied of its disgraced and stunned occupants, Seraph looked up at him again, tears drying on her scales, her voice small. "Why?" she asked. Elias managed a small smile, one that was tired but real. "Because we know what it's like," he said. In the months that followed, human influence grew, not through battles, but through trust. The Drakari began to rebuild, with human engineers working at their side. The tribunal rewrote its own rules, forever changed. And across the galaxy, other species began to understand a dangerous new truth. Humans didn't need claws or fire to dominate. Sometimes, all it took was the courage to kneel, open your arms, and let the whole universe see what had been done wrong. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more content like this. See you next time.